Yeah, this is a panel on local news, which has sort of been my sort of obsession ever since my wife and I started a local blog in Ditmas Park like 7 or 8 years ago. Just basically on the principle that people are, like very interested in the stuff that I grew up covering, which is to say like Barack Obama, and then very, very interested in like the fate of the bagel store and their corner, and then like kind of almost decreasingly interested in everything in between, or at least that's been my experience. And local news, I don't know, New York has always been a particularly fun and exciting thing. I grew up kind of like dreaming, wanting to be Jimmy Breslin when I grew up. So yeah, I just wanted to quickly introduce the panelists. Liena Zagare is the publisher of Corner Media, which publishes 7 sites from Fort Greene to Sheepshead Bites. She's also my wife, with whom I started that first blog, but she now has turned it into a thing. Jen Chung founded Gothamist in 2003, and it's really proved one of the real enduring New York media outlets. Also ask her about subway etiquette. She has many thoughts. And I've also known all these folks for quite a while. I've been begging Jen to link to my blog post since about 2003. Tom McGeveran was my old editor at the New York Observer. He named the first New York City political blog, The Politicker, which was over my objections. It was my blog, but it was a better name. He's now the founder and editor, co-editor of Capital New York, which is a really interesting kind of high-velocity, ambitious entrant into New York media. And Michael Ventura is the managing editor of DNAinfo, another new ambitious site that's driving the incumbents totally crazy every day. And I guess I thought I would start just kind of go and maybe start with you, Michael. But I'm curious just how you define local. Like, what's local? Is it the bagel store? Is it City Hall? Where do you draw that circle?
Well, I think for us, I would say there's probably 2 definitions of that. I think local, in one sense, means here in New York City, the 5 boroughs and neighborhoods in it, and we have another site in Chicago, so the neighborhoods of Chicago. But I think it's a little bit more than sort of the physical boundaries. I think there's a sort of, I like to say, like a cosmic thing, like a connection to places. Like, people want to feel connected to each other and their neighborhood and things that affect them, and so to me, local is sort of all of that means. So it does mean City Hall in some ways. It does mean the bagel place. It means the fire. It means who got murdered. It means what the politicians are doing. So all of that combines to define that.
What about you, Tom?
Yeah, I mean,
is Capital a local publication? I don't know. Sorry, I should have asked before I invited you to this panel.
It is. It's not, at least not yet, a local publication that's also a publication about neighborhoods. And I think that one of the things that's unique about New York is its size. Well, that's just, sui generis. But it makes it a slightly different proposition. I lived for a while in a town that had 15,000 people in it in Minnesota, which ultimately did get a patch blog, Northfield, Minnesota. And to them, local is the bagel store in City Hall, mostly because the guy who's running City Hall might also own the bagel store at that particular point in time, And in New York, it's slightly different because, you've got this sort of citywide thing that's going on, and then you've also got all of these very specific things happening in neighborhoods with very specific, different dynamics going on in them. And I think, different ways of slicing and dicing that up accounts for a lot of the differences between a lot of our sites who are up here. I mean, I think it's a nice mix of perspectives.
So I totally agree with what everyone has said and probably will say, because local is the bagel store, it is City Hall, it's knowing about, like when I started Gothamist, I had no idea who my city council person was, and that's one of the reasons why I was really interested in starting it, because I was like, wow, I didn't know what this was. I bet my friends have no idea too, and it was a way of empowering people. But Gothamist, which definitely covers a lot of local things, we've started to cover things outside of the city, which sometimes freaks people out, but then sometimes we get a lot of tips saying, please, can you cover this thing that's happening on the other side of the country or in New Jersey? And so sometimes they are the water cooler topics. Like,
counting New Jersey as the other side of the country?
well, I grew up in New Jersey, so it does feel like that at times. But, for instance, we had a reporter go down to the day the Revel Casino closed, and because New York is also pursuing this huge push into possibly lots more casinos, and there is also this mystique with Atlantic City, and I don't know, it was just a really interesting story to us, and it was a really great, piece, and it was actually really popular with our readers, which was also encouraging to see. So I think, the people around you are also talking about things that aren't necessarily happening in New York, like Ferguson or things like that. So I think there's a way to also filter those, topics and current events into the local.
That reminds me of the attitude that the Southern District of New York takes, which is that everything is in the district of the
Absolutely.
Southern District of New York in their jurisdiction. Liena.
Yeah, I come to local from an urban planning perspective. So for us, the neighborhood is the physical neighborhood where people actually live on a daily basis. And the way we cover Brooklyn is focused on the commercial hubs and the subway stations that define each neighborhood. So it is very geographically defined. That said, New York is a city of more immigrants than I've ever seen in one place. And that does speak to what you say. It's like we have large Pakistani communities or large Jewish communities or large Black communities, and you have to touch on the subjects that are relevant to them. And it's a natural way to cover.
And so just to, I guess in some ways, jump to, I think, what is like a question a lot of people who are watching local media with some concern, and not I think are not all aware of, I think, like how vibrant the new digital stuff has become when they weren't paying attention. What I think when a lot of people think about local news, that now they think about collapsing metro newspapers, sort of like local TV, which was once had Jerry Rivers barging into mental hospitals, and now like just does much less political reporting, much less investigative reporting than it used to, and wonder what's going to replace the sort of accountability function of local media, which is to say, like holding investigative reporting, holding politicians accountable, catching politicians when they screw up, exposing policy failures. And I guess I wonder, if you see yourselves as having a role in that, if you see yourselves expanding your role in that? Anybody? I don't know, Michael, you?
Yeah, I would say for us, yes. That's a very big part of what DNAinfo is about. Like largely the newspapers, we feel the Post and the News, and to some degree the Times have largely abandoned that kind of space. And the Times gets a City Hall scoop pretty often, but we really, for us, we really want to provide that kind of coverage that you're not really getting anyone's really doing anymore, because it's important, and it's also good for traffic. People like that kind of thing. So I think that we, the people at this table, also DNAinfo in particular, can fill that space, and to a large degree are filling that space.
I mean, you sort of have that idea that what maybe, or some people who romanticize the old days of print probably have this idea that it used to be that politicians just saw a shadow on their doorstep every morning, and it was some pit bull reporter who was just going to take everything they did and turn it into a giant issue. And one thing that's happened a little bit is that the internet has removed a lot of the need for the press to do the kind of day in, day out mediation of the relationship between the public and politicians, because they all have public schedules, they're out all the time, they're talking all the time, everything that comes out of their mouths is recorded instantly, and it becomes almost more of an interpretive thing to do that kind of day coverage. But for the investigative stuff, I mean, I think one of the things that's happened is that there's a difficult value proposition for advertising for old newspapers, and even to a degree for television stations, on doing those kinds of sad news stories that often come out of serious investigative work. But I also think that the digital operations, I mean, I think it's not going to be overnight, but are doing an awful lot to fill in the gap. And I predict absolutely that it's going to be a much richer sort of scene for holding politicians accountable in the next couple of years than it ever was.
Yeah, and on the sort of romanticization front, when I started in City Hall, there were still old-timers who could remember when the politicians would deliver a pallet of alcohol to the press room every Christmas, or be trashed by the press, and that was kind of that was the golden age. Jen, what about you? I mean, you guys have very deliberately moved into kind of original reporting. I mean, do you see yourselves? I mean, are you looking to break some, bring down the next mayor or whatever? Is that what Gothamist is?
I mean, certainly, I'd love to do that. And what's great is that as there are more organized websites, blogs out there reporting about these things, I think they really encourage and inspire other people to take up the challenge. And what's really exciting is we don't focus on politics. And so I read a lot of Capital New York to catch up on that, or Politicker. But there's certain enterprise pieces that we've been working on. We've been working on a lot of Vision Zero stuff. And there's this one case in Queens where a police patrol car hit a young college student, a Japanese national, and he was killed. And it happened near the projects in Queens. The police probably thought no one would care, but we were digging for a while, and surveillance video shows the cops' lights aren't going on, and it really suggests that the police are covering something up. So there are certain stories. We can't do everything. Gothamist is independent, so it's myself and my partner who own it, so we're very strategic about what we cover. But what's exciting is that there's so many other people out there who are covering things, so when they have those great stories, we can write about them and link to them and spotlight those things, and maybe we'll follow in the next round.
There's a more collaborative spirit somehow.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing a lot of people say when you get into something like this, and everybody said it about us when we started, and I'm sure you guys all hear it. At the same time as everyone laments the lack of local media, every time you want to do something, everyone says, that's a pretty crowded space already, isn't it? And what's your plan for killing the New York Times? The thing is that if you don't have a rich media ecosystem, it's really hard to talk to people because they don't know, you always have to start from zero explaining everything about what's going on. When there's a richer landscape, sure, there's more competition, and that makes everything, I think, better, makes everyone better and more on their game. But also, more importantly, it's a richer media context, and it's often advantageous to be able to, report and write into that atmosphere. There's just richer storytelling.
Yeah, for sure. And Liena, how do you see, I don't know, sort of that kind of accountability stuff coming out of hyperlocal?
I mean, this is what Jen said. It's like we do actually cover these neighborhood stories where some, people getting tickets for walking in the park, or landlords not doing repairs that need to be done to subsidized housing. And it's just, it's really good to have a platform to bring these issues to the neighbors and have the conversation within the neighborhood and be able to, talk to the local elected officials. Would we like to have somebody in the city hall that can actually stand there and ask for the questions directly every day to have them answered? Yes, one day. But in the meantime, Gothamist picks it up and it gets a bigger megaphone and, hopefully gets resolved.
One thing I wonder, I guess I'll ask you all, but starting there, do you see yourselves as traditional objective journalism? Do you see yourself as a community activist? Is that a choice? Sorry, I should have prepped you for that one.
Okay. I don't know that it's a choice. I think what we're trying to do is give voice to the neighbors that live in our neighborhoods that we cover. And so we'll speak up for issues that don't have that kind of presence. But all right, the crime is probably the best one. We'll always cover crime, whether or not our real estate agents who advertise with us like that fact. Oftentimes, they don't like the fact that, there's a shooting, there's a mugging, there is something happening that is unsavory. We still cover it. Why? Because I think it makes a neighborhood better because people talk about it. It's not hushed, it's not swept under the rug, and hopefully it can get resolved. And that's, if that's advocacy, then yes, then we want to do that.
Yeah, do you guys see a different relationship with that question than maybe the old papers had? Or do you feel that you're basically in the kind of tradition of, the Times or whoever?
Well, I feel it's important for us to cover issues that can encourage, our demographic, which is, probably some of you students here are in it, but like I want to make sure that I can still live in the city. I would like more affordable housing. I would like for all of those artists that make the city an interesting place to be able to live here. So I think we do take a somewhat negative stance towards a lot of, this idea of the city becoming, the billionaire's haven. So, in that aspect, we are kind of an activist. And also, we do cover certain stories that spun off of a lot of like Occupy Wall Street. Like today we've got a few people covering Flood Wall Street and, giving voice to some of those people with those movements. And I think it's just important for people to keep remembering that instead of seeing another, again, like New York Times real estate story about someone's parents buying them a multi-million-dollar apartment, so.
Well, I mean, we sort of have made a conscious decision that it's not, it's not that sort of claim of objective journalism that we do, but we're just much more focused. We chose a pretty specific focus, and it's on policy and politics and business. It's almost, a materialistic point of view on things. We want to sort of expose the gears, for good or ill, for whatever parties are involved. And so, for us, that can mean maybe that we, spend a little bit more time on backroom deals taking place between Entergy and this or that state agency, rather than, for instance, the climate protests yesterday, which we, did a little bit about, and then Flood Wall Street, which I think we're doing a little bit about today. Then our angle on that would tend to be a little bit more like, how serious a problem is this for the local politicians and various WAGs and media organizations, and that doesn't represent a decision about what's the best way to cover stuff. It's just a place that we found for ourselves.
What about you, Michael? You guys do have this kind of, I don't know if boosterish is the right word, but do you champion the neighborhoods that you cover?
Yeah, I think that, for us, having an authentic voice is very important. Like a lot of our reporters live in the neighborhoods, and we all we all kind of live here, and the city is important to us. We're not trying to run the city down. We're not trying to boost it up. This is the city, and we're writing for people who live here without being so focused that nobody else who lives anywhere else would get it or not be interested in it. But we're not trying to write for one demographic who is like a wealthier demographic, and so we don't have a lot of, oh, look at these people in this neighborhood, and aren't they weird? It's like we're of the city, and so I guess that would be our version of boosterism. But we throw a lot of punches too, and this sort of indiscriminately, we're not trying to protect this group or drive that agenda, but we try to be independent-minded, objective, but aggressive news organization.
Yeah, it's funny. I think a lot of people at one point associated digital journalism with kind of ranty opinion, but really the only place you can find that now is the newspaper editorial pages. And speaking of which, how do you guys interact, if at all, with the kind of television and newspaper outlets that still probably spend hundreds of times as much resources as you guys do covering and often getting beat on the same stuff that you cover? I mean, do you have...
Well, they're always trying to rip us off, that's for sure. I mean, we have a whole wall in our newsroom dedicated to stories that have been run in other newspapers that we had first. So there's like the Times is on that wall, the Post, the News, other places.
Do they credit you?
Sometimes, but not all the time.
Do you jump up and down about it when they don't?
It depends on what it is. Like today, we did a story on the First Lady here in the city, and 2 hours later, the Daily News had matched it, but there was a link there. Sometimes that's not always the case. It sort of depends on their mood or whatever, but it happens a lot. TV is, they've come at us many times about doing things together, but they're kind of lost in this. They don't really get local news anymore. To them, it's like New Jersey is like New York City news, and we're like, we're not about that. So it's a weird relationship with them. I think the papers feel like they compete with us. Like I know that just anecdotally that DNAinfo is on in many newsrooms around this town because we break a lot of news, and they're always trying to chase us. And we like it that way.
It's hard to envy local TV guys who have to have half an hour and have to like nail the reader in Brooklyn, New Jersey, and Connecticut. I mean, that's not an enviable challenge.
And I was interested in something that you said at the beginning, which is that just at different times, legacy news organizations have come to do some kind of partnership. And I've found this over and over again. So we've had a couple of successful partnerships, but they're really almost not partnerships. Like if it becomes just the case that, you're like, we would love anytime you'd like to invite us for us to put somebody on the Reporters Roundtable at Inside City Hall, that works. But a lot of other kinds of partnerships with those organizations don't work, and part of the reason I find is related to the reasons they spend so much money and don't necessarily get results. It's because the bureaucracy that you interface with as soon as you start talking to anybody about doing anything is so immense and intractable.
And you want to work on the next story too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically like their approach is, you've got really great scoops, and we want to like feature that because we don't have any scoops, and we're really cool. Like we're like this big media organization, and you want to hang out with us, but we're not going to really do anything for you. You give us everything,
And
we'll
also
not give you anything.
you'll maybe sprinkle some internet fairy dust on us, and then we'll get traffic to our website.
And also the production time on the stuff is going to be like, I don't even know why you want to do that story like 3 days from now. It's,
Yeah. And Liena, do you care? At this point, like, is it a big deal when they rip you off and don't credit, or does it not matter? Are they still an important source of traffic, of attention?
I think ultimately it doesn't matter. It's a little hard to quantify traffic that we'd get from a local news link on the cable television. I haven't seen anything in the back end, but I quite agree. The time commitment to go on TV is huge, and we're like very thinly staffed. So it's like, does anyone have an hour or two to take out of the day?
For like a 2-minute
No.
segment. I mean, that's the other thing.
So
Seen by who knows, right?
My parents.
Well, that's important. I mean, in New Jersey.
and then 3 days later, when they've organized the permanent link to the video for it, then you can send that out.
I mean, one frustration though also is, a lot of people read newspapers or watch certain television programs because they've been conditioned to do that. So they're not, they don't really kind of get that, there's all this other media out there that's for you. Like, I've been reading the Daily News my whole life. It's like being a Yankee fan. It's been inherited, and I think people's media habits are inherited to some degree. And trying to break, this is a problem for us trying to break out of that is, if the Daily News rips off a Capitol story and the reader sees it in the Daily News and there's no mention of Capital New York or DNAinfo or whatever, like it's not, then it's sort of keeping that layer and perpetuating that sort of idea that the Daily News is on top of a lot of things.
So do you think do you think primarily about taking readers from the Daily News, or do you think primarily about like shaping the habits of people who haven't quite decided yet?
I mean, I like a little bit of both, but I think that, I'm trying to get at people who are New Yorkers, and what their other reading habits are don't really matter to me as long as they swing by my website a couple times a day. But
Yeah, actually, we shouldn't beat up the Daily News, actually. They break a lot of news. Employ a lot of good reporters. So probably the biggest investment in local media in the last ever, in fact, was Patch, which, if you don't know, is this massively expensive network of 800 local sites around the country that AOL lost, I think, like more than $200 million on. I mean, imagine what you could do with $200 million. And then earlier this year, essentially collapsed, although there is now a small team trying to figure out what it can be.
But it's under new ownership, right?
Yeah, they sold it off. And I guess I wonder, well, first of all, like, does that mean no one will ever invest in local media again because it was such a disaster? But then secondarily, like, what are there lessons you guys take from that? I think I'm going to start with Liena because she sold one round of her sites to Patch and then worked there for a year.
I did. I did sell my Brooklyn sites. They turned into Brooklyn Patches, and then long story short, I left Patch and I restarted my sites because I had to keep living in the neighborhoods that we covered. And yes, I have a slightly different vision. That said, I'm incredibly sad about Patch just because I think it was, maybe I'm utopian, but I actually think it was possible, maybe not at that scale, maybe not quite as rapidly expanding, but there was a ton of really talented reporters who were employed. And in many ways, what I'm doing in Brooklyn is not all that different from what Patch was doing all over the place, which is having a dedicated reporter covering their town or neighborhood. And, you know, in Brooklyn, some of the neighborhoods that we cover like 100,000 people, and some of the towns that Patch covered was like, 7,000 people. So, as you said, like, the town hall and the pizza guy are the same person. But yeah, all in all, I think it's just sad. I do think that, DNAinfo is a big investment in local news, so you can take that.
Yeah, do you guys get credit for bringing Patch down? There was a minute when people were saying, well, these are the two competing national.
There was like a piece in the Financial Times that made a passing reference to Patch. I forget exactly what it was. It was writing about another site in another state, and it said, joins the pantheon of local news sites like Patch and DNAinfo. And I've always found that sort of comparison odd because Patch was so gigantic and we were very focused. I think there's a lot of room for investment in local. I think people might be scared off by what happened with Patch, but I think that was more like the way they did Patch more than is local interesting and can you do. I think it's all about the way you do it.
I also think that DNAinfo is an urban site. Patch was a suburban site, essentially. It was covering, subdivisions, which is not easy to cover at all if you're trying to do it that way. I'm sort of like, the more I watch the local news, I think the old regional model of like having urban centers have a big media company that covers it. That's where it's going.
Yeah, I'll say this about the whole Patch thing. It may be that it's the end of a certain kind of investor with a certain kind of point of view on the business, putting tons and tons and tons of money to get to a large scale very quickly on local, because it's a lot of what was wrong, I think, with the approach with Patch is what I'm hearing.
Tim Armstrong was an ad guy first, right? So he was just thinking he would get all that local ad money, and this would be the way to do it for AOL.
And then it would be a thing that would be worth many multiples very quickly.
Yeah.
That's quickly is I think the key word there.
Yeah.
I do think it's possible to do that. I just don't think it's quick.
I don't think it's quick, and I think it's also it's a more modest proposition, which is not to say that it's not an incredibly successful or proposition. One thing that we've been seeing as an analog on the print side is newspapers that used to be controlled by families, then were controlled by boards of directors after becoming public companies, like the New York Times Company and at one time the Washington Post Company, and then going private again. Because Jeff Bezos can have a very successful business proposition in the Washington Post without it necessarily having to increase its size or value by 20% every year. And the New York Times Company now can't do that. So they have a much higher bar to cross. And so I think that and DNAinfo is an example of a place where we're not talking about a public offering. You know what I mean? We're not talking about. We're talking about.
Whenever the DNAinfo idea.
Well, yeah, but and then organizations that started as bootstrap organizations, as I think I could say all three of ours were, that's another proposition entirely. It's a very organic.
And still are. I'm running like 4 other sites in other cities, and I'd love it if I could double the staff in my other cities, but I can't. So since I don't have like AOL behind me, a lot of our moves are really strategic and conservative.
Those folks must occasionally come to you, and you must have chosen not to, right?
Well, I think that we're sort of happy the way we've run things, and after all the horror stories you hear from some of these other places, you have a survivor here, so you get spoiled also being able to work the way you like to work. And that's the great thing, because there's so much technology out there now where a lot of people can have their own operations in a really like slim fashion where you're not spending a lot of money.
Fred?
I just wanted to ask you a question about what's happened to Joe Hines' legacy. Joe Hines was the district attorney here in Brooklyn, and it turned out that a whole significant number of cases he was involved in were immensely problematic in terms of the information gathered, in terms of the path of prosecution. I just wondered how you guys, all four of you, have covered. I think I can call it the Hines scandal, not unfairly.
I'd say we pick our spots on that. So we've done some stories on it, but it's not a day in, day out story for us. So.
It's us either. I mean, we've just sort of, and part of it for us is that we just sort of took in a bunch of investment from Politica about a year ago, and we expanded a bunch. And we realized, we've just brought on a DNAinfo guy, Colby Hamilton, to write about the courts, and partly because I think we saw a whole bunch of stuff happening that we didn't really have a way to cover, like the Hines scandal, but also all of Preet Bharara's activity in the Southern District that really mattered to the political people that read us, and we didn't quite have a way in yet. So so our response is developing. ...
Same here, but we've been very interested we were really interested in the Brooklyn DA's Democratic primary. And so we were covering a lot of Ken Thompson, who eventually became the DA. And we happened to have a freelancer working with us on primary day, and he went to a polling district in Williamsburg, and he found like people going in repeatedly to go vote. And so that was just the cool story that we were able to break. And they were supposed to vote for Hines.
That was amazing.
Yeah, so that was sort of interesting to us. And we hadn't been necessarily following a lot of.
Were they getting like toasters or something?
Yeah, they were being promised different things, and it was just sort of like the thing to do, that it was normal. So it was just sort of fascinating how that unraveled. And because I think on a general level, we're all upset with these cases of men who have been wrongfully imprisoned for decades. And so when one of those men is freed and the city gives over settlement, we'll cover that. And I think now with more of those cases happening and unraveling, and the email trail was amazing, but yeah, we can't necessarily cover it every day, but when there is that news story that breaks. And that's where the dailies are awesome, because they have a lot of those entrenched connections. And also that's why I miss the Village Voices reporters like Tom Robbins and Wayne Barrett. Those are people who really knew their way around. So, I mean, I hope that all of us in different ways can build up those connections and sources to find those things.
We did not do much by way of original reporting, mostly relying on the New York Times and the dailies too. And then essentially linking up both sides of the story, so to say. I mean, given that we cover bits of Midwood and bits of Flatbush, both the cases that did not get heard and the people who did get convicted wrongfully resonate.
Yeah, I mean, I bet that in 5, you have the same panel in 5 years, and the big scandal will be very competitive among these news organizations. But this is at the moment when it's like the dailies for big metro investigations. That's definitely still where you go.
I mean, it's a big question to me where the dailies were on this. When we were all still fledgling.
This is
while it
true
was
that the
actually
dailies
happening,
missed this story, from 1987 until the present. So
yeah. So I don't even know.
Yeah, I mean, so it's right. It's not. Although it's such a different moment, I think in some ways the dailies were probably cheering on the occasional wrongful conviction by the early 90s.
Right,
So.
You got to break some China.
Yeah, it was such. I mean, that's part of this story, right? It was such a. There was actually a great Village Voice story, to saying this, that it was such a different moment, that people were so much less worried about wrong. The detectives were under all this pressure. Back to a technical media question, and I guess starting with you, Jen. I'm curious, these sort of ecosystems in which certainly BuzzFeed lives, but in which most media now live, Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, Google, aren't local. You know, your networks in those places aren't local. And how does a local publisher operate inside these networks that are really very global? And
I think, you know, what is hard is because all of us are just reading all these things. I mean, sure, we're in our sort of local bubble and we're focused on what each other is doing, but also for me to get to click one of those links, it has to really be able to strike a chord. And, you know, we're just hoping and praying that we pick the right headline, have the right image, or have the right hook to get you in. And so maybe we've tweeted or Facebooked out the story one way, maybe we'll do it again another way later. And, you know, the other hope is that anything we're writing about is something that another person would be interested in. Like, that is the kind of thing you'd want to send to your friends. So
in New York.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think most people's friends are in New York for our readers, but, you know, the kind of thing that you would send to someone else, like, isn't this so crazy that I live in this city where this is happening? So, you know, that's also part of the hope. But not all of the stories that we do can be that. But, you know, again, it's hopefully we have a few that are the like big performers, and then that can sort of buttress the smaller stories that are maybe more personally important to me, but, you know, aren't the movers.
How do you think about that, Tom? Do you guys care about traffic? I mean, no, I mean, that's a legitimate question. They have a subscription model. It's a different... I mean, Jim once said in public, I think, that like traffic is overrated, which I thought was really smart.
Right. I mean, right now we don't. I think there's a phase where you have to care about it, and we're just not there yet. And there are a few things going on there, and they make me almost like not a great panelist here. I mean, you know, one thing is we have a very expensive subscription product, and that's one of the things that is also local news that's really meant to be subscribed to by companies and organizations. And that sort of is the main thing that funds all of the local reporting we do that's free. And the reason that that has made sense for us is because our reporters, before we had a paywalled product, had all of this stuff in their notebooks that was just like, but this is too technical for a wide audience. And, you know, nobody who just wants to know, you know, what de Blasio's position is on traffic deaths, you know, his Vision Zero program, you know, needs to know this complicated stuff about federal versus state laws about streets or whatever it is, you know what I mean? And it was just like, well, so this stuff's already in our notebooks, and there are people who do care about it and who are really, really geeky on this policy stuff. And there's an audience for that, and they can actually subsidize it. There's something quite organic about it, you know what I mean? So in other words, it's not like we have to publish a cute puppy slideshow in order to pay for a hard-hitting politics piece that everybody needs to read, you know what I mean? And what that means is that most of our revenue so far has come from stories that we send directly to the email inboxes of subscribers. So it gives us a lot of freedom on the free website because our chief revenue generating publishing platform is actually an inbox, you know? It's not even a website, you know?
Yeah, no, email. I mean, email is sort of the underrated social network, and we get tons of traffic from it.
And it's super targeted from that point of view. For what it's worth, though, I think Twitter is a little bit more targeted than we think. You are relying on the user for the targeting to a degree, but I mean, for instance, my feed looks very different from my brother's feed, looks very different from my coworkers' feeds who are, you know, report other things from what I do. I mean, I have a lot of food, a lot of like pop music, a lot of, you know, local New York news. That's like what I've got in my feed, you know? And so, you know, I think once you've got a little bit of road behind you, those social networks kind of, they solve a bit of that on their own. We've at any rate found that a lot of our traffic is, I mean, Twitter is probably our biggest single referrer.
I mean, traffic is important to us. For us, a lot of it comes through Facebook, and we put out a lot of neighborhood newsletters. Each neighborhood has one, and we have borough ones and a citywide one. So you were saying email is a big thing for us too. Drives a lot.
Yeah. With neighborhoods.
Same here.
I think we probably have time for a couple of questions. Yeah. anybody has questions. Sorry, I should have warned you. And in their absence, I'm going to ask one more really geeky question, which is, I wonder if kind of mobile and geolocation are things that any of you think about. Like, I think about it in terms of local, but actually it seems super promising, but then it's a little hard to see what it does.
We, for us, we've been geo-targeting, or we have that we've been doing that in our stories for about a couple of years. It manifests itself on the site. If you go to a neighborhood page, there's a map with dots of where things happen. We're doing a lot of
If I open a DNA story, does it know that I'm here and going to serve?
It doesn't. It's not that advanced.
No?
We were sort of doing it in the future. We would get around to something like that. But
Yeah.
We find a lot more people are coming to the site from their mobile device, either through social that way, or to the site directly, or through the email. So we're very much working on maximizing that. Yeah.
I mean, I think the infrastructure for that on the sort of service provider's side is far from being in good enough shape to be adopted by smaller news organizations like ours. So, 5 years ago, I was talking to people about how big this was going to be for local, because the idea would be if you had this. Well, first of all, everything was supposed to be an app. It wasn't just supposed to be on the web, on the phone back then, right? So you have your app, so that has push alerts on it. So if you live, say, in Park Slope, then it knows when you're walking, when you're walking by Smiling Pizza, and it tells you, come in, all slices $1 for the next 15 minutes or something. And just seemed like this magical thing that would provide unbelievable direct ROI to these, return on investment to local advertisers, which is frequently the problem, because if they're going to spend what is a lot of money to them, $500, $300, $1,000 for an ad, they need to know what it did for them, and it can be hard to articulate.
That doesn't quite work in the mobile web.
I haven't seen it yet in a way that bundles well with local news.
Right.
But
Yeah, it's hard with news because you could say it seems like a Foursquare kind of thing, oh, you can get a deal in this area because you happen to be in it, but you don't want a thing that pops up and says, hey, there's a triple homicide around the corner from here.
A lot of people might work in Manhattan, but they live in Brooklyn. Yeah. So what does that mean? So it's
change your location.
I mean,
right.
I don't know, Jen, do you have if you open Gothamist from New York, from one of your other cities, does it know and tell you something, or it's kind of so much work for not that much?
No, I mean, hopefully the stories are still interesting even if you're not there. So that's my goal.
It doesn't push you to one of your sister sites or anything?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think it could be annoying too. If you ever try and actually read the British version of The Guardian online, you have to really force your browser to understand that even though you're in the United States, you would like to see Guardian.
Yeah, no, we worry about that a lot. Right, and you're sort of getting some second-rate localized knockoff, and you want the real thing. Yeah, I don't know, Liena, you got. We got a question here. Oh, hey, Warren. Speaking of patch.
So if you're not going on traffic as your sort of key indicator of how you're doing, what are the things you use to measure whether or not you're fulfilling your mission? Is it revenue? Is it some combination of engagement time and traffic? Or how do you decide, or how do you determine if you're doing a good job?
That is a good final question for each of you.
Well, I care about traffic because our revenue is completely from advertisers. We don't have a backer, so page views are important to us. And so we try to have good, interesting stories. Yes, we might have some puppies, but maybe they are puppies that were at some, shelter in the city. But then we are also going to have other good, interesting stories that sort of, fulfill our interests in serving the city and like informing them. So.
I don't know what's wrong with puppies.
I
Why
know.
everyone's so dismissive of puppies. Like, this is a price we have to pay.
realize-
Puppies.
yeah.
We will pay
You
this
need to do
price
like
in pounds of
politicians
puppies.
and pets.
The internet demands
Well,
puppies.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. And by just even using the phrase puppies, I sounded like a lot of people who are really dim-witted about their media criticism about BuzzFeed in particular. And it's an amazing, amazing thing how and it's mostly jealousy, I think. But I mean, for us, it's not that it will never be traffic. Advertising has to become an important revenue stream. It's just not the one that we're beginning with. In the meantime, what we care about is revenue, because that determines what our budget's going to be next year to expand with, and engagement. So especially since we're so newsletter heavy and so email heavy, we can tell what percentage of people opened the email and when, and how deeply they read, how many links they followed from it. And so we track those metrics extremely closely on a daily basis. So
I'd say similarly to both these guys, we track traffic is very important to us, but also our newsletter signups and our Twitter followers, and how much time people spend on the site, and how many stories they click on when they get to the site. Sort of all those kinds of metrics are very important to us too.
you can also often see, I mean, many of us, I think, probably look at the thing that tells you how far down the page they get, whether they click through slideshows or not, all that kind of stuff, just to make sure. It's not just to be like, it's to make sure we're serving, I think we all do it, we want to make sure that we're serving readers.
Yeah, we got a
Real quick. We care a bit about traffic. I care more about return visitors and users. I care most about overhearing people on the street saying something. What I've found is that once we reach a certain penetration within a neighborhood, advertising gets incredibly easy because everyone is talking about it, and it is the most effective way to get the word out within this particular neighborhood, and then businesses want to be part of it.
Cool. Well, thank you guys all for coming. Thank you, future internet watchers. And thank you guys all so much for participating in this.
We just got off 3 questions.
Oh, I did? Well, I'm afraid time's up, but you can come and ask them questions.
Thank you.